I just want to start by welcoming everybody to Chase's Mill and our ongoing series, A Sense of Place. I'm Sharon Spalding. I chair the Mill Hollow Heritage Association, which owns and operates Chase's Mill in Alstead, New Hampshire. And since we were unable to open last summer as planned because of the pandemic, like everybody else, we jumped on the Zoom bandwagon and we've been hosting a series of virtual events. We've been using these events, though, to really explore what it is that makes Chase's Mill and the surrounding area so unique and so special. And tonight, we're continuing the series with Noah Elbers from Orchard Hill Breadworks. And Noah, we're thrilled to have you here. I think this is going to be a really fun evening, and everybody I know has been looking forward to this. I want to start, though, by first of all welcoming anybody to this event tonight who is not already familiar with Chase's Mill. And if you're not familiar, we are a nonprofit. For the past 4 years, we have been renovating this historic structure that is just over 100 years old, but it rests on foundation stones that date to 1767. It's quite remarkable. And for the most of the past 250 years, there has been a working water-powered mill on this existing site. So we're really, crossing our fingers that we can reopen next summer to the public as planned. And when we do so, we will be a center for hands-on learning. We'll be hosting classes for children and adults. We will also be a community gathering space and a living museum. So you can always check us out on our website if you'd like to learn more or talk to the person who invited you tonight. How tonight will work. We have Becky Howland with us, who is our fabulous filmmaker who has been working with us on a couple of these different events. And we will show about a 25-minute tour of, it's an interview with Noah and a tour of Orchard Hill Breadworks. And after that, then I will spend a few minutes talking to Noah. I have some additional follow-up questions I'd like to ask, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So again, if you haven't yet, put yourselves on mute and enjoy the next 25 minutes of this wonderful presentation. Thanks.
Welcome to our ongoing event series titled A Sense of Place. This time, we're taking a look at grist mills, old and new, the mills that produced flour from wheat, rye, and other grains for baking bread. A mill to grind grain was so necessary to the survival of an 18th century town that Alstead's original proprietors decided in 1766 to pay Timothy Delano to build a grist mill here on Warren Brook. A famous Tory named Simon Baxter bought the mill a few years before the American Revolution. After he was forced to flee to Nova Scotia, Levi Warren bought the property and gave his name to Warren's Mills and to the lake and brook that still powers a mill right here. Today, the doorstep at Chase's Mill is one of the original grindstones from Alstead's earliest grist mill. Grist milling ended in Mill Hollow in 1858, when the Messer family bought the grist mill and converted it to woodworking. But we can still see an old grist mill in Alstead Village. Viewed from the Cold River, it's 3 stories high, and the date 1793 is carved above the front door. The original mill burned in 1839 and was rebuilt. This mill had 3 run of stones, 3 pairs to grind rye, barley, or corn for animal feed in addition to wheat. The mill ground 20,000 bushels of grain in 1867 and continued as a grist mill into the early 1900s, when these old photos were taken. It's hard to believe today, but raising wheat was common in early settlements such as Alstead, and in fact, northward into Coos County and the White Mountains. By 1820, soil fertility decreased and diseases further reduced the wheat crop. It was vulnerable to blast, a kind of mold or fungus. Around 1830, midges that fed on wheat became common. Sally Loomis was a frequent letter writer who bemoaned the difficulties of raising wheat or other grains. "We had 192 bundles of rye and a little piece of oats, and they wasn't knee-high to a toad," she wrote in the summer of 1830. In another letter she complained, "All our wheat is blasted." Sally longed for a wheat cake and even bought a little, despite the high price, so that we should not forget how it tasted, as she wrote. In the mid-1830s, a barrel of flour cost $10.50, as much as a man might earn in a month. When railroads came through New Hampshire around 1850, it became cheaper to buy Western wheat. In 1850, Alstead produced 919 bushels of wheat, but 25 years later, none was recorded. Today, the newest grist mill in Alstead is not far from the site of the earliest grist mill. Let's travel up Old Settlers Road to visit Noah Elbers at Orchard Hill Breadworks.
From the beginning, what inspired me about baking was my ability to reach others and feel connected to a wider group of people through the food that I offered. I think as humans, we seek and are nourished by our opportunities to meet and come into contact with and have real experiences with others. In 2007, a counselor at the Orchard School summer camp said, "Hey, let's have a weekly potluck pizza night using the brick oven." And for that entire summer, every Tuesday, we cooked pizzas with whoever happened to be around, which was usually 15 or 20 people. Some summer camp counselors, friends, family. But very quickly we saw that that kind of event was attractive to and exciting for something to do in the summer. That summer of 2007 made a really strong impression on me, as it was kind of everything that I love about food. It was making something delicious that we could share with a lot of other people. And so while the oven that we used that year was actually retired and demolished, it was our bread oven at the time, and we replaced our bread oven that year. What it opened the door for was to build a new outdoor oven just for baking pizzas in. Many, many more people started to hear about and come to pizza night. And that summer in 2008, we would often make 40 or 50 pizzas instead of 15 or 20. And by the end of that summer, I realized that something was going to need to change about pizza night in order for it to not become too much like work, basically. I thought to myself, rather than making it something where we sell pizzas to the general public, and that instead of my bakery staff having to add more hours to their work week, I would invite local nonprofit groups who wanted to raise money to come and staff the night with me. So starting in 2009, we invited a different nonprofit group each week to send, I think the first year was 4 volunteers to help me run the night. And we would make the crusts, our guests would bring their own toppings, and I would bake them in the wood-fired oven. That really became incredibly popular. And as a concept of something to do on a Tuesday night in the summer with your family, we saw upwards of 200 people. What draws our pizza night guests to the place? While I've never run a poll, I can assume based on the comments that I hear, the fact that we welcome our guests to participate in the activity of making their own pizza. It makes for a collaborative effort, which when it goes well, collaborative efforts are always the things that people feel the most filled up by, where they get to participate in some way. So this is, in the baking world, this is called a black oven. The way that works is that directly in the chamber where the fire happens, all of the baking also happens. So to operate this oven, I light a fire in this chamber and let that fire burn. And during that firing process, the heat from the fire and the coals is being soaked in to the floor and the dome of the oven, and over the period of hours, or in some cases even more than a day, the heat that is soaked in is then available when I'm ready to bake all of the whatever you're putting into the oven. So in this case, when I'm baking pizzas for pizza night, I have a really big, hot, intense fire that I burn for about 20 hours straight, with the majority of that time being where the coals from the fire have broken down and are sitting on the oven floor and soaking lots and lots of heat into that very heavy, dense stone mass on the floor. When I'm ready to bake pizzas, I sweep the ashes. There's no coals left. There'll just be some ashes on the floor, but the floor is usually over 800 degrees at that time. And not only is the surface of the floor 800 degrees, all 10 inches of the stone base of the oven is also somewhere between that 800 degrees and 600 degrees or so. What I think of, and I describe these as at that point, it's like a fully charged battery. And over a 3 or 4 hour period, as I'm baking pizzas, it's like the pizzas are the thing that pulls down the energy from the battery. But each one, as it sets on the oven floor, sucks a little bit of that heat out, and that heat is then in the pizza. The pizza is removed, and so over the course of that time, the heat in the oven is drawn down. In addition to the heat that's been stored in the oven during the firing prior to baking, I light a small fire on the side to help to cook the tops of the pizzas. So what most people think of when they see a wood-fired pizza oven is the fire on the side, thinking that that's really the thing that is heating the whole pizza and cooking the whole pizza. It's both and. What's the primary source of cooking is the heat that's been stored up in the floor of the oven for hours and hours prior to baking even starting, that when the fire was still filling the whole oven. This oven we built it ourselves, and it is about 3 tons of heavy stone material. And so after a baking where I've baked upwards of 300 pizzas, the stone is still 500 degrees, and that heat, if I put the door on and let it sit, that heat remains for several days after the baking is complete. Grist mills are an ancient technology. while there are some elements of this that are fully 21st century, the basic mechanics of this machine have been around for several hundred years.
Here we have Heman Chase's model of a grist mill powered by an overshot wheel. This wheel uses the advantage of the height, called the head or fall of water, as it strikes the wheel. The miller opened the flume. This is again the wooden flume that carries water to the mill wheel, and this lever here opens the gate to the flume, and then water strikes the top of the mill wheel. That's why it's called an overshot wheel. The buckets, and these are all made of wood, the buckets carry the water downward, and so this rotates in this direction, and you can see here the various mechanisms of wooden gears that turn ultimately the grindstones at the top of the mill. A couple of things about this arrangement of buckets. The overshot wheel was fairly efficient in that we had, as I mentioned, the weight of falling water. The drawback to it were, first of all, that it required constructing a flume high enough to carry water over the top of the wheel, and second was the difficulty in times of flood. So the spring freshet, as it was called, the spring flood, and the fall rains were good time for milling because the supply of water was plenty. The drawback of this kind of a wheel is that as it turns in this direction, rotating forward, it kind of carries the water backward in the opposite direction from the brook. In times of high water, if the water backed up against the wheel, it could actually bring it to a stop. Nevertheless, this kind of overshot wheel was fairly popular and fairly efficient. Notice that all the gearing here is made of wood. So if we turn the various parts of the wheel, as I would only do very, very carefully, we see this large gear turning, and then this kind of rotational motion in a vertical plane is transferred to rotation in a horizontal plane by this wooden gear that's called a lantern gear. And I think of that as having the kind of bars like an old kerosene lantern. So that this is the arrangement that transfers rotary motion in a vertical plane to rotary motion in a horizontal plane. Here above, we see the two millstones. And outdoors, we have a very, very handsome grindstone that we can still see. They turn with the rotation of the wheel and ground the grain between the two stones. The tongs that you see here were used to lift off the upper wheel called the runner. And the wheel every now and then had to be lifted off because the runner needed to be away in order to expose what was called the bedstone. The bedstone was the one with the grooves in it, and it did not rotate. The runner spun over it and crushed the grain between the two stones, and then the grain spread out the sides, as you can see from the grooves that we have downstairs. Notice that all the gearing on this mill is made out of wood. So a couple of disadvantages: wood wears, and it tends to swell and shrink with moisture. The advantage for wood is that millwrights were able to work with wood very efficiently, and they were able to repair their own mills. So this kind of gearing could have been replaced or rebuilt at any time by the miller himself. That was a large advantage. Almost nothing here is made out of metal. We see one wheel hub that is, but otherwise all the parts were made out of wood that the millwright would have been able to repair and manage himself. This grist mill model actually shows how the grain would have been carried upward in those little buckets that we can see and come back up to fill into the hopper and be then bagged by the miller into these tiny little sacks.
The wheat is poured into the hopper here, and it drops from the hopper down this central chute. When the mill is operating, the hole in the center in the runner stone, which is the stone that is spinning, allows the grain to fall in between the stones, and then grooves in the stone allow the grain to pass from the center out towards the outside. And there is a pattern that is cut into the into the stones that feeds the grains outwards from the center. And if you recall any number of different commercial cracker packages or bread packages, you can think of the image of a millstone, and it is exactly what this millstone looks like, because the packaging companies got that idea of that emblem from the actual thing. So the millstone spins, and as it's spinning, the grains are first crushed from their whole size into smaller pieces, and then ever increasingly smaller as they pass towards the outer edge of the stone. Once they exit the stones, they arrive to this chute, and the flour is deposited into whatever type of bin we place underneath the chute. We decided to add milling to our bakery operation because for the first several millennia of bread baking, the connection between the farmer and the miller and the baker was very, very, very direct. Over the course of the industrialization of food processing, that connection between the land, the farm, the farmer, the miller, and the baker, like so many aspects of modern life, those connections were severed and largely forgotten. And the benefits of those connections were left untapped. So the first thing I'm going to do is I will start the millstones, and you'll hear the motor start up and the belts turning. So now the millstone is turning, and I'm going to turn on the auger that's going to start feeding grain down into the mill. Now I'm going to adjust the millstones so that they're tight together. As social animals, I think humans, anywhere in the world that you look, there are ways that that towns or the ways that we organize are largely around family of some form, whether it's extended or just a small nuclear family, and then a place outside of family that is like where the work happens, where like we kind of express what we do in the world. And then pretty much everywhere there's also a third place where it's not about work and it's not just about family, but it's about a bigger circle of people. And without even thinking about it in this way, what Orchard Hill has become is a place that is open to everybody, and a place where anybody can come and many connections are made. And the forms that takes are sometimes just two customers arriving at the same time and bumping into each other. And other times we have upwards of 300 people here enjoying an outdoor picnic meal, meeting people they've never met and meeting friends all at the same time. When I look at like how I arrived where I am, it's not like I took a giant brave leap into the unknown. I was building upon and sort of embracing what was already here and adding something to it, which I don't think is as celebrated in this country, especially right now. Everything's about like being cutting edge or breaking the mold, and while there are of course always elements of that in anybody's life, I think it's an underappreciated part of how we can make places special is by kind of recognizing what already is there and then finding what can be added to it that makes it better.
That was great. Let me introduce Noah. Noah Elbers believes that good food and happy, healthy communities go hand in hand. Bread was first baked for sale at Orchard Hill in 1997, but the story of this place begins in 1972. Noah's grandparents purchased the land and buildings that are now Orchard Hill Farm and Breadworks. In the early years, it was merely a late 1700s farmhouse and a dusty barn, which sat at the center of 30 some odd acres of fields and forest. Since that time, 3 generations have planted orchards, tended gardens, built homes, launched a school and a community center, and helped a bakery grow and flourish. Noah, it's really great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thanks. Before we open it up for a Q&A, I just had a couple of questions I wanted to ask, starting with Elliot Birch. And you had talked a little bit about how your experience of building an oven with Elliot, and for those of you who don't know Elliot, he used to live in Mill Hollow. But you talked about that experience of building an oven with him as being something that had a great impact on your life and now your career as a bread maker. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I knew Elliot throughout my childhood, and they were neighbors and friends. And I caught wind of his plan to build an oven. I was a junior in high school, I think, and spent a day one fall stomping on clay and mashing it up into lumps and throwing it on top of this willow framework that he had constructed on a fieldstone hearth, and kind of, caught my attention for sure as a neat thing to do. And the story that still kind of resonates the most with me about those early first couple years is a day that was either a snow day from school or it was a weekend. But anyway, there was a snowstorm and I got a call from Elliot and he was like, "Hey, do you want to come over? I got the oven fired and hot, and you want to come over and bake something or help?" And it sounds so quaint, but I literally put some food, I think maybe some beans or something to cook, in a backpack and put my skis on and skied from our house here down through the fields across the lake to Elliot's house, and arrived there in the middle of a snowstorm with the smoke coming out of the oven chimney and the fire in the oven itself. And that really has always stuck with me as a moment that that kind of influenced the rest of my life.
And you also spoke about Well, hang on, actually, Elliot, I see Elliot raising your hand. You want to say something or comment on that?
Sharon, can you hear me?
Yes,
Do you have a time for a quick story from my perspective?
absolutely, Elliot, go for it.
So this is very funny. And this is one of the things I remember the most about that whole several years of my life. I also had a mill to grind wheat into flour. And one week, one of my customers showed up with a Ziploc bag, and inside it was what I believed was a burnt wheat berry that had somehow skipped through the mill process. But she said she thought it was a mouse dropping. And I said, "Oh, Martha, no, 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 it's not a mouse dropping. It must be a burnt wheat berry." And so, but I felt bad. And so the next week, it was around Halloween. And for some reason, I had this big plastic rat for decorating the punch bowl or something. And so for the next week, and I only baked every Tuesday, and I baked 3 dozen loaves because that's how many loaves would fit in that oven. I took a big wad of dough and I put that rat inside it and shaped it and let it proof and baked it. And so Martha came to pick up her bread that afternoon. And I said, "Oh, Martha, I'm so sorry about last week and that possible mouse dropping. Here, you must take this specially large loaf as compensation." So she did. She took it home and it was still warm, and they decided to break into it and discovered that inside was this plastic rat and just about died laughing. So that was one of my best pranks, I think, of my whole life.
Elliot, what was your experience though? I want to just ask you about Noah and Noah coming to help you. Did you realize at the time what an influence you were having on him?
Not really. What I find amazing is that with no training and no internet and no books, somehow I ended up being able to bake pretty good bread. And I didn't follow the standard protocols that people follow these days. I just don't know. It was like a miracle. But I was glad when Noah came along and he basically took over my little operation. I was going back to grad school and was too busy to do it anyway. And so I'm stunned to see what he does today. He is my hero, the biggest hero of my life. So thank you, Noah.
Thanks, Elliot. Well, Noah, it kind of brings me to my next question, which has to do, when Elliot was talking about this miracle of this bread, you talked about bread making as an art form, as something that is really about, it's an artistic expression more than mastering or following a particular recipe. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I think we are a culture, we're enamored with cookbooks and experts and the idea of like perfecting a technique and buying gadgets to help us perfect those techniques. The great thing about bread is that it really requires only some very basic raw materials, and the person who's practicing the craft, their commitment to an engagement with like a very alive, active process. And it's only through like application of and dedication to that process of discovery that people actually turn out good bread. You really can't, there aren't like gadgets that make it happen, and there is much writing and YouTube videoing that people do. Certainly those things can help move along the process, but not unlike playing a musical instrument or arriving at learning to do oil paintings or make pottery or any number of things that just require a relationship between the maker and the product. Bread is very much like that. And there's a lot of really wonderful bread books, and there's a lot of really wonderful YouTube, personalities making good bread. But largely those, like, bakers arriving at a place where they make excellent bread is about just performing a very humble and often humbling set of simple and intuitive acts. It's not a lot of it's not flashy, and it's not it's not something that until one has like really applied themselves to it, that comes as comes instantly to anybody. So I mean, usually a instrument or a painting or two, or like even just like writing poetry. Like, none of us are just gonna be able to sit down and have something of excellence just sort of spring forth, and that's what makes it wonderful.
And it was funny because yesterday when we talked a little bit, you talked about how you had failed miserably so many times in the beginning of trying to make, what you consider good bread. And also about the broader community of bread makers, that people were, it's a very supportive community. But I'm also wondering if you could connect that to the apprentice program that you offer now, because that was something we didn't get a chance to talk about in the film, and I know is really important to you.
Sure. So yeah, two things. That question is often posed around, like, what got you into and how did you learn to become a baker? And some key elements to that were that in the early days of the bakery, I was really it was like walking into the art studio with a blank canvas and a whole bunch of and all of the tools that I need, which when you're making bread, you need like a tub and a bucket of water and some flour. It's not, the tools are not elaborate. But I had all those things, and then the space to just experiment and create. And yes, like I said yesterday in our conversation, early days were really rough. I just didn't know what I was doing. And while Elliot started his process really before there was, 3 or 4 years before me, there were very few books and there was no internet. By the time I was starting and really exploring baking as a craft, there were a couple of books and some names sort of floating around that I had heard. And that's how I became, acquainted with and grew my knowledge, was through mentorship. The baking community is close knit and very open and generous and unfailingly, those with knowledge that I've come in contact with are more than happy and willing to not only just like talk on the phone for a couple of hours, but the number of people who've actually just come here to the bakery because they had heard about what I was trying to do and wanted to spend some time here are a number of people who in the baking world are like the very well-known bakers, just are that generous and make themselves available. As I've now been doing this, I suppose in some ways I'm one of those people. I would say in the general sense, especially of how what I really love to share with people, and I think I share pretty effectively, is the kind of evolution of not just how to make bread well, but how to foster and engage with the community in a way that people are inspired by. And that doesn't so much have to do, I mean, it has somewhat to do with making really good bread, but it almost an equal part has to do with knowing and being a part of a community, and being responsive to what customers are interested in. And that evolution of this place, I think I've been curious about what are the elements of this place that have worked. And in sharing that, I never say to anybody like, you'll just be able to go somewhere else and like, make a carbon copy of what we do and you'll be great. But it's more like, here are these elements that have really worked and made this place flourish in a lot of ways. And there are ways that something will flourish in almost any place. It's just a matter of getting in there and finding out what it is. And it might not be anything like what you see here, but it is possible, because 20 years ago coming here, you wouldn't have said, oh, this is, just prime territory for the business that is here today. Where you might go to a street corner and be like, wow, if they put a coffee shop right here, that's going to be a slam dunk. You're going to have a successful business right away. I don't think anything like that you would have necessarily known, but it has proven to be possible. I didn't answer anything about the apprenticeship program, which I do want to just say quickly that indeed, yes, the apprenticeship, we have, ever since the very first years of the bakery, I've had some form of co-working with bakers in training. In the early years, honestly, I was very much an equal novice to many of the people that I was working with. And through their good graces and my own humility, I think we made it through some, sometimes of like, I don't know. And then they would be like, I don't know either. And, we got to the other side. Now that we've been doing this for a long time, that process of, I often think of this place, it's like we're in an encyclopedia of both things to avoid and also a repository of tremendous gifts of many dozens of people. Certainly by no means is this a representation of just me. Both apprentice and employee alike over the course of 20 years have made, and we have tended this place in such a way that as we welcome apprentices, we are kind of both providing the opportunity for them to see and experience what we do, and also we very much see as a part of that to be open to what each individual brings to this place. And so to that end, we have a program now of 3 year-round full-time residential apprentices, and that program is we welcome people from all over the country, and it, like everything in baking, and I describe this frequently this way, is we will never arrive at like the formula for how to run the apprentice program and have it completely figured out and just like punching numbers on a calculator. It is alive and vibrant and messy, just like life.
Well, thank you. That was actually going to be my next question, or something similar to that, which is, at the mill, one of the things that we are hoping to resurrect is when we open, we will be a center for hands-on learning. People will be able to learn by doing and be able to make a mistake and figure things out. And, it parallels to a large extent what you've been talking about, of course, in a very different way, a very different expression. But I'm just wondering, kind of as my last question before we open it up to everybody for a Q&A, what are some of those elements of keeping a community, that experience of community, that sense of connection? What do you think are the key elements to keeping that, creating that kind of a community and then sustaining that kind of a community, especially in a crazy world in which, I mean, here we are doing a Zoom call, a Zoom event, but how do we incorporate technologies that still allow us to have that sense of shared experience?
Mhm.
Did that come out as a question, or I'm not sure. Anyway, any comments, and then we'll open it up for
I
everyone.
know we do want to get to some questions, so I'll promise to be brief with this. And there isn't really, of course, one or even a dozen points to make that would encompass enough to really capture that answer. But what I think is something that we experience quite frequently through the acquisition of knowledge and then confidence around that knowledge. We think we know something, and then events naturally occur that reveal how little we actually understand, and that being humble in the face of that and able to accept that that at any time we are pretty sure we've got it figured out, just around the corner is going to be the thing that that we didn't expect or that we need to adapt to. And community is like that, in that the individuals and the we find comfort in the idea of like structure and solidity and predictability, and we sort of rest there. And very rarely is that the place where life and kind of dynamic vibrancy also exist. And so I would be the first to admit that I am both the person who looks for and embraces the idea of sort of safety or solidity and predictability, and need the reality of life to be confronted by that, and just accept that we are creatures that are just vulnerable to everything the universe has to offer, and that quite often is not what we expect or hope for or want, and it is to our own peril that we ignore that fact.
Well said. And we thought tonight was about bread making. All right, let me open it up. I know there's a lot of questions that have been coming in on the chat. And I'm going to just, let's see, I saw one from Janet Warren earlier about what type of grain, what types of grains. Where is the question? Let's see, Brendan or Brian, help me out here. Yeah, what grains do you grind, and do you sell your flour also?
Yes, we sell our flour. We sell it primarily directly from here at the bakery, and we are milling wheat, spelt, and rye primarily right now for our breads. So the wheat is grown in upstate New York, and all those organic. Rye also from northern Pennsylvania and upstate New York, and spelt from a farmer in upstate New York.
And then I see there's a question here from Heather. Would I be able to share this recording? Yes, we will have this on our website. Give us about 5 days, and then you can find it on our virtual programming tab on our website. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions in here?
One one that you asked yesterday and that we didn't get to touch on, I'm happy to answer any, but was the question about like why bread right now and what has gotten everybody so obsessed about baking their own bread.
Yep,
Um,
especially during COVID right now. It's
yeah,
it's number of people making bread, starting sourdough starters, all that
right,
kind of thing.
yeah. And my answer on that actually isn't specific necessarily to COVID, but I think COVID did sort of turn the volume way up on all these things that were already stirring a lot, and that we hear through our apprenticeship program largely. People have a really deep and urgent need, and more so now than ever, to have something tangible that both brings comfort and also a sort of a sense of having some agency over just their place. Our largely our modern world has severed the connection from other people, from our food and the sources of our food, and many other things. These sort of very stark compartmentalizations of our existence, and that's pretty new, I think, for humanity to exist that way. And bread has both the element of the moment that you start thinking about bread, especially sourdough bread, you are connecting back to the dawn of civilization, basically, in that it was without the dawn of agriculture and the farming of grain, like none of civilization would exist, or not as we know it, basically. It tracked very clearly with the growing of grain and the baking of bread through history has been what allowed humans to do what we do. And that, I think, is instinctual in our sense of safety. Of course, in our modern times, it's not a literal sense, but more of a figurative ability to connect with something tangible, and then see the sort of outcome of this investment of our time and energy into something that's both very, very simple and delicious, and I know this sounds like a contradiction, but infinitely complex, if that makes sense. We start with elemental, heat, grain, and water, and then what comes from it there's no bounds to the flavors and ways that it will surprise us and be unknown or unpredictable. So yeah, that, I guess, is a piece that I think we see very much in the applications for the apprenticeship. People hungry for, literally and figuratively, for reconnecting with things that we can see and touch.
Thanks. We have 2 minutes left officially, but I want to go ahead and end this part of the evening, and then let everybody know, though Noah has agreed to stay around for about 15 to 20 minutes so that we can really extend the Q&A. But if anybody needs to leave at 9 o'clock, please feel free to do so. And, before I formally end it, I want to just, first of all, Noah, thank you, because it's fascinating. It's been so much fun to get to know you better, and it's been really fun to just have these discussions with you. It's really been wonderful. So thank you for all of the time and energy that you've put into this, and the time that you were willing to take for us to film, and the pre-conversations and all of the preparations. I really, really appreciate it. The second thing I want to say also is that tonight's program is made possible by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So a big thank you to our sponsor this evening. So with that, I'm going to officially end the evening, and please feel free to drop off if you need to, but Noah's willing to stay around for about 15 to 20 minutes. And probably the best thing at this point to just make it a little less formal is if you have a question, or if you put a question up in the chat and you'd like to ask it, just raise your hand, and Brendan will notice that you're raising your hand, and then we can call on each person one at a time so Noah can take the question. The one exception to that is I saw that Miranda, who has her video off, had a question for you, Noah, and it had to do with who comes up with the recipes and how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny. I like that it's going back to this idea of recipes, because so baking in a professional setting, it's not that it doesn't have anything to do with recipes, but I would describe the importance of the recipe, which I'm gonna so a recipe would be like the list of ingredients, how much of each one, and maybe a couple of instructions. That's maybe like 20% of what matters in bread making. And the rest of it is like, how well do we as bakers understand the fermentation process and how to shepherd the tens of trillions of microorganisms that are alive in the dough, from the process of leavening and making that bread rise through to the oven. So like, it's not that I don't think about recipes, but the question is more like, how do we as a team of 12 or 11 or 12 people successfully collaborate on a daily basis to as well as we possibly can make beautiful, delicious, and consistent bread. And that's what's exciting, because the interaction and the the engagement with a team of people, all of whom are committed, but no single one with absolute authority or absolute understanding, just makes for a process that like, we're humans. We like, when we do it well, that is like the very essence of like, I think what we want to do on earth is sort of like figure stuff out with other people in a way that feels joyful, simultaneously fulfilling. And I mean, I think we all understand how that happens on like an athletic team. Like, it's like a bunch of people, and they know the object of the game, and they're all like in close communication with each other, so much to the degree that you don't even use words anymore, but you're doing something that requires both an incredible amount of skill and knowledge, and you've done it so much that you no longer really think a lot of the time about like what you're doing, but your body knows how to do it. I mean, it used to be all over how we worked together, and whether it was building buildings or working in fields, like a lot of this was just like deeply in our DNA, and largely is lost in the workplace, but it still happens in a bakery where people care about what they're doing, because that's the nature of the work. We are like in here.
But how do you balance, let me just ask, how do you balance that with, if I'm coming to buy bread, I want to make sure that I've got a good loaf, right? I mean, how do you balance that with the need to produce a consistent product and run a sustainable business?
That's the only way that it happens, is by people doing that. So I was talking about in the beginning how the gadget fixation does rule many home baker lives, like how many gadgets can you accumulate to like help you along. And it's not that professional bakers don't have that same tendency. For a number of reasons, I've chosen to keep this bakery very analog. We have a wood-fired oven that our baker's relationship with the oven and engagement with like how well they're doing is very much like a minute to minute, hour to hour, like a mental process. And the same goes with doughs. Like lots of bakeries have very well controlled indoor environments where the humidity and the temperature and all of those things are like very tightly controlled. If myself and my team of bakers didn't really care and feel committed to the process that we're in together, we would make really marginal bread. Like our bread would be very poor because we don't have any crutches. We don't have any, anything that makes the process like just push a button or turn a dial. Basically, we have to show up like all of our senses and all of our wits and our strength. Like we're lifting, we're doing, and I mean, like I said in the last answer, like I think pretty much that's at the heart of what humans mostly want to do, is like use their bodies and their brains at the same time doing things that, feel like they matter. And
Bring joy, as you said.
Well, that's very much what baking is like. But to answer specifically your question, you only get a good loaf of bread out of here because that's what we do every day. And we don't mess around with like, if people are here who don't,
you're gonna go up to the bakery?
They are not going to enjoy work here.
That's a great answer, Noah. Who else? Who has a question? Who else? Brendan, help me out here.
A couple of related questions in the chat about.
Oh, okay.
We also had, I believe is it pronounced Taffy? I'll ask you to unmute right here, and then I'll pin you on the front of the page.
Okay. I have a question, Noah, about your oven and the people who came to build it and how they came to build it and how you knew about them.
Great. Thank you for asking that question, Taffy. And it's nice to see you. So another great question. Like I said, the baking world is pretty small and close knit. There are a few commercially available wood-fired ovens, that are for sale around that could produce the kind of bread or the amount of bread that we want to bake here, or that our bakery needs to bake. This is the oven that's behind me here. Is from Spain, and after graduating through the first two ovens that were built on site by myself and a couple other people, or many other people, sorry, not a couple other people, including Elliot. Those two ovens, we'd sort of moved through the scale and the amount of bread that they could produce well. And so the next thing was either going to be a larger commercially available regular like gas-fired or electric oven, or continuing to work with a wood-fired oven. And the oven that's sitting behind me is just as expensive as a gas-fired or an electric oven. But there are a few reasons why, and I think I answered a little bit before about why I chose, or why I think this was the right choice for us. The one being that I think while it takes way more training and commitment to get good at baking in an oven like this, baking in an oven that has automatic features like where you just sort of turn a dial or push a button to make things happen, the opportunity to like develop real knowledge and feel like you're doing something that only you or somebody who's applied themselves to it can do, not just like anybody walking off the street can do, is really valuable. It makes work a lot more interesting. It makes work a lot harder and a lot more demanding. I mean, harder in the sense of like, oh, I'm really bad at this. When I start, I'm not good at it and I need to learn how to do it. And then, but if you commit yourself to learning, then you get to have this amazing skill. So the oven comes from Spain, and we had two oven builder, or the process of purchasing this oven involves sending to or hiring the oven builders to come from Spain to do the building. And so we had 10 days while they were here, and we we built the oven together and we hosted them here. And that's the other part of why I think this versus something that would just be unloaded from a truck and plugged into the wall feels so valuable, is that for the rest of my life, I'll know and have this bank of memories of this incredible experience of like hosting two Spanish oven builders who didn't speak a word of English, who I got to like try to communicate with, and who thought this place was totally weird, but they loved it. And it was profound. It was just profound. It was like, that's the stuff. And then, so at the time I was probably baking bread, like just the baking part of my job was probably like 25 to 40 hours a week, depending on the season, where I'm going to be standing in front of this thing. And I may as well have a relationship with both the thing and this history of it, so that it's like, oh, I'm here, I'm here all the time. I may as well have this, something of value that I feel about this tool.
That's great. Thanks. Brendan, do we have anybody else? And then Bryony, maybe you could just follow up with any questions from the chat. Brendan, anybody else raising their hands?
I don't see anybody raising their hand right now. So maybe if Bryony wants to read the question from the chat.
Okay, great. Bryony, you there?
Sure. Yeah, there were two related questions. One was about whether you can buy the bread anywhere else than at the bakery. And then the other one, someone who I think knows that you can, asking, other than the bakery, where do you sell, what's your top selling store?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we do sell our bread all over the Monadnock region. We are in Vermont and New Hampshire. If you drew a circle around the bakery of about 35 to 40 miles, there are locations dotted throughout the 25 or 30 miles around, 35 to 40 miles around the bakery. And the store that we sell the most bread is the Monadnock Food Co-op in Keene. It's only been open for the second half of the bakery's life, or even less than that. Prior to that, the Putney, Vermont Food Co-op and the Brattleboro, Vermont Food Co-op were the places that we sold the most bread. But Monadnock Food Co-op in Keene has just been a really amazing hub of the community, both for our bread and lots of other producers. We're not going to talk all about just this one co-op right here, but it's pretty inspiring what in 2008, or maybe, no, it was 2010, maybe they started talking. Anyway, we sponsored the Monadnock Food Co-op at one of our pizza nights when they were just like 6 or 8 people talking, forming the board and having this idea that there was going to be a community food co-op in Keene. Sort of like my pointing out that, like, if you looked at this place 20 years ago, you would not have thought, oh, in 20 years from now, this would be a great spot for this vibrant bakery. Looking at Keene in 2009, 2010, I had a really hard time imagining that there was space for this hub of local food, local food outlet. And the Nanoc Food Co-op has proved me wrong. I believe their purchase and sale, their purchases from local producers, Anton might know better than I, but it was over $2 million last year, I believe, approaching $2 million worth of local foods.
Wow.
Small producers.
We have, Elliot has something that he wanted to add at this point, and then I think we probably need to.
It's my bedtime.
What?
It's my bedtime. I have to be back in. I'm back in here in like 9 hours.
Okay, well, we'll wrap up. Elliot, we'll get to hear from you, and then we'll officially say goodnight. And anyway, so Elliot, let's hear from you, and then we'll close up the evening.
Just a tiny bit of history that may be of interest to some of you. Where I got the idea to bake bread in a clay oven. I had been living in Plainfield, Vermont in 1980 and 81. And at the time there was a baker there, a husband and wife. His name was Jules Rabin. And their bakery was called Upland Bakers. And they were part of the Bread and Puppet Circus troupe. And back in the 70s, they had done a lot of touring in Europe for putting on these puppet shows that are just epic. Anyway, when they got back one year, they decided to build this massive stone oven. It was kind of like Noah's second oven, but maybe twice as tall. And they baked serious bread for decades. And so I was eating that bread, and their rye was like you needed a chainsaw to cut it because the crust was just indelible, but it was so good. And anyway, about 1983, I got married to Kathleen and moved to Mill Hollow. And no one, nowhere baked any bread. There was nothing to buy, and I was kind of addicted to it. And so I think about 8 years went by before I said, well, I got to do something about this. So I went back to Vermont and up to Plainfield and got some starter from the Rabins. They were kind enough to give me the starter. They didn't give me any instructions, but I got this tiny little book called The Clay Ovens of Quebec. And then I was at William Prentice's little garage sale there in, what's the name of that little town on the way to Walpole?
Drewsville.
Drewsville, yes. So I went into his antique barn and I said, I'm looking for a cast iron oven doors for my oven I want to build from Quebec. He said, oh, I got just the thing, the beautiful arch double doored thing for like $20. And the rest is history. So anyway, the whole thing started for me out of desperation because I was dying to get some good bread and no one in the Monadnock region sold it. So thank you, Noah, for providing for everybody now.
Hey, I have a question for you, Elliot. I feel like I've been maybe telling people a myth, but I have this memory. Hold on 1 second.
Uh-oh, should I hide?
I don't know, but Elliot, are you still making bread?
Yeah, I just one loaf at a time in my oven, regular oven, but I have plans to build another clay oven, but that's another story.
Okay. So Elliot, I think it was for my 20th birthday. You gave me this rolling pin.
Yeah, I remember that.
I've been telling people that you turned this at the mill.
Yeah, I did.
You did.
I used, Heman had a machinist lathe. He might have had a woodworking lathe too, but I didn't know how to use the woodworking lathe. But his machinist lathe, and Margaret, I guess it's still there, right? Anyway, I turned that on the machinist lathe, which is mainly used for metal cutting.
Yeah.
But it did a great job.
It's still in use daily.
All right, that's super, great.
It's a beautiful piece of curly maple.
Yeah, thanks.
That's great.
May I answer, Elliot?
Yeah.
Elliot, I can't imagine that Dad allowed you to use the machinist lathe with wood.
Maybe he didn't know.
The wood lathe. The
The
wood
only,
lathe,
the only
wood
time
lathe
he,
is still there. They're both still there.
the only time he reprimanded me was I had some brass object, non-ferrous metal that I needed to shape. I forget what it was for. And any of you out there like James Gruber would know this. You never use a stone, like a stone in the drill press, a rotating stone, to grind non-ferrous metal, because the bronze or the brass will clog up the pores of the stone. I didn't know that, because I had seen him grinding all kinds of metal objects down there on that rotating stone. So I thought, wow, I just got to grind this away. And he reprimanded me for that. But that was the only time. I'm sure he showed me how to use that lathe, and he probably knew I spun that present there for Noah.
That's a great story, Elliot. Thanks for sharing it. And we have to close the evening, because I promised Noah we would wrap it up and let him get to bed so he can be fresh tomorrow morning for baking. But I just, before we say goodnight, thank you all for joining us. Noah, again, thank you for participating in this evening. We will have the recording of it available on our website. It should be, probably within 5 to 6 days, maybe sooner. And we will start back up again in February. We don't have a date yet, but we are planning to continue with the virtual programs, and it will be sometime in February. So anyway, until then, everybody have wonderful holidays and a great happy new year. And until then, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thanks, Noah.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Noah, thanks again. This was terrific.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.